Any future relationship would be based on mutual respect, honesty, and recognition of my autonomy. I was no longer willing to sacrifice myself for the convenience of their comfort. My message was firm, resolute, and clear. The past was acknowledged, but it did not dictate the terms of my present or future. Through this process, I began to understand the complexity of maternal love. It is not self-erasure, nor is it blind sacrifice. Boo! True maternal love requires courage. The courage to stand firm, the courage to say no, the courage to prioritize one's own well-being when necessary. I had learned that the hard way, through betrayal, through silence, through manipulation, through loss. And in that understanding, I discovered a freedom that had been denied to me for decades, a sense of power that was neither aggressive nor cruel, but deeply just. Even as Daniel and Jessica tried to reach me, I remained steady. I no longer measured my days in calls returned or gratitude received. I measured them in moments of clarity, choices made with integrity, and a life lived fully on my terms. The small apartment in Portland became my sanctuary, a space where I could reflect, grow, and live without compromise. My work, my friends, my hobbies, and even the quiet moments of contemplation were no longer interrupted by a sense of obligation or guilt. I was free not because they were gone, but because I had chosen freedom over submission. Spring arrived in Portland, bringing with it the faint scent of blossoms and the gentle warmth of longer days. I found myself wandering through the city, noticing details I had never truly appreciated before. The old oak trees lining the streets, their bark rough beneath my fingertips, the small cafes tucked away on quiet corners, the laughter of children playing in parks I had once hurried past. Life, I realized, had always been there, waiting for me to claim it. Oh, I had spent so many years investing every ounce of my energy in Daniel's life that I had neglected my own, and now it was mine to embrace fully. I began to invest in myself in ways I had postponed for decades. Art classes, something I had longed for since my youth, became a weekly ritual. I painted landscapes, cityscapes, abstract pieces, letting my emotions flow onto the canvas. Each brushstroke was an assertion of independence, a declaration that my life had meaning beyond the roles I had played for others. My apartment filled with colors, textures, and forms that reflected not the expectations of a son or a husband long gone, but the essence of who I was. Work at the hospital provided a grounding rhythm, but I no longer allowed it to define my identity. I chose shifts that suited my life, took breaks when I needed them, and allowed myself to accept help from colleagues without guilt. For the first time, I felt a balance between giving and receiving, a harmony I had never known. My relationships with patients were no longer solely about duty. They were about connection, empathy, and genuine care, free from the burden of self-sacrifice for an ungrateful family member. They had realized that my resolve was unshakable, and the tone of their communications had shifted from demands to tentative attempts at dialogue. I read some, ignored others, and responded only when I felt it necessary. Each interaction reinforced my understanding that respect must precede love. Anything else was a trap that could lead to disappointment and resentment. I had learned that lesson at great cost, and I refused to repeat it. One afternoon, as I walked through a local market, I encountered a young woman who reminded me of Daniel at his age, eager, ambitious, slightly overwhelmed by life's demands. She was struggling with her groceries, and without thinking, I offered to help. We chatted as we carried her bags to her car, and she spoke of her dreams, her fears, her aspirations. In that moment, I realized that maternal instinct, while deeply personal, could extend beyond bloodlines. I could nurture, guide, and support without surrendering my own autonomy. Love, I discovered, could be expansive, liberating, rather than binding. The sale of the Seattle house had brought financial security, though not enough to retire completely. I used part of the proceeds to pay off debts I had accumulated during the years of supporting Daniel, and the remainder I invested cautiously. I met with a financial advisor, someone I had ignored for decades, and began planning a future that was truly my own. Travel, hobbies, education, and leisure, things I had always postponed, were now tangible possibilities. The world, once narrowed to a single focus, now seemed vast and inviting. Even as I embraced my independence, memories of Daniel's cruelty lingered, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, but always present. I remembered the words he had spoken, the coldness in his tone, the dismissal of my sacrifices as if they were nothing. And yet I also remembered the years of love, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices made out of genuine care. The truth was complex. Love could coexist with disappointment, loyalty with betrayal, and hope with grief. Accepting this complexity became a form of healing. I began documenting my experiences, not for Daniel, not for the world, but for myself. Journals filled with reflections, letters never sent, and musings on life, motherhood, and the pursuit of autonomy. Writing became a sanctuary, a way to process emotions, clarify thoughts, and assert control over my narrative. Each page was a testament to resilience, a chronicle of a life reclaimed, a declaration that my story was mine to tell. Occasionally, I considered reaching out to Daniel, imagining conversations where understanding replaced resentment. But each time, I remembered the pattern of the past, the disregard for my feelings, the entitlement, the assumption that my sacrifices were owed. I realized that reconciliation, if it ever happened, would require more than words. It would require change, respect, and acknowledgement that had been absent for too long. Until then, I chose to protect my peace, my dignity, and my sense of self. Through this period, I also reflected on the nature of boundaries. I had spent years conflating love with obligations, sacrifice with worth. Now I understood that boundaries were not barriers but protections, structures that allowed relationships to flourish without suffocating the individuals involved. I practiced saying no, feeling the strange liberation that accompanied it. No to guilt, no to manipulation, no to undue demands. Each refusal was an affirmation. My life, my choices, my happiness mattered. One evening, a knock at my door startled me. A neighbor, holding a small basket of flowers, smiled warmly. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said. We chatted for a while, sharing stories of our families, our work, and our lives. It struck me then how much I had missed these ordinary connections while focusing entirely on Daniel. Community, I realized, was another form of love, mutual, respectful, and enriching. These connections did not demand sacrifice, but offered companionship, understanding, and joy. The months turned into seasons, and I found a rhythm that was both familiar and new. I celebrated holidays in my own way, indulged in personal traditions, and took pleasure in the small victories of everyday life. For the first time, I experienced freedom not as a concept, but as a lived reality. It was not without loneliness or reflection, but it was authentic, grounded in my values and choices rather than the expectations of others. Datum arrived with a crispness that made Portland feel alive in a different way. Leaves turned fiery shades of orange and red, and the wind carried with it a sense of change, a reminder that time moved forward regardless of our desires. But I began to see it as a manifestation of immaturity, entitlement, and fear, a combination that often blinds people to the love and sacrifice around them. Understanding did not equate to reconciliation. It was a personal exercise in closure and liberation. One evening, while attending a local art exhibit, I encountered a woman whose story mirrored parts of my own. She had faced betrayal from family, struggled with ungrateful children, and found herself questioning the worth of her sacrifices. We spoke at length, sharing experiences, tears, and laughter. It struck me then how universal my journey was. So many people had walked similar paths, yet few had the courage to reclaim their lives fully. Our conversation became a mutual encouragement, a reminder that resilience could be nurtured collectively, not just individually. As winter approached, I found myself planning a solo trip to the Pacific Northwest, a journey that had long been postponed. Hiking trails, coastal cliffs, and forested paths awaited, offering both solitude and adventure. I packed carefully, not out of necessity, but as a ritual of preparation, an acknowledgement that life could be pursued on my own terms. The trip was transformative, a series of moments where I felt untethered, alive, and wholly myself. Each sunrise over the mountains, each wave crashing against the rocks, each quiet night under the stars reinforced the lesson I had learned. Life was not a debt to be paid to others, but a gift to be cherished for oneself. Through these experiences, I discovered the profound power of self-determination. The past, with all its sacrifices and heartbreak, had been a foundation, but it did not dictate the present. Each choice I made was a step toward authenticity, freedom, and fulfillment. I had learned to honor my feelings, assert my boundaries, and pursue happiness unapologetically. The journey was ongoing, but the trajectory was clear, toward empowerment, clarity, and peace. Spring arrived in Portland with a gentle warmth, sunlight breaking through clouds in a way that felt like nature's reassurance. The city seemed renewed, and so did I. My apartment smelled faintly of fresh flowers I'd placed on the windowsill, a ritual that reminded me daily of life's small joys. Each bloom represented growth, resilience, and the beauty of reclaiming one's space in the world. I had spent months healing, exploring, and rediscovering myself, and now I felt ready to embrace a deeper sense of purpose. Messages from Daniel had slowed to a trickle. I didn't miss them. Each ping or text used to trigger anxiety now barely registered. I checked my phone out of habit, more curious than desperate, but no longer dependent on it for validation or connection. The house in Seattle had sold quickly above the market value, a practical confirmation of the choices I had made. I watched as the new owners moved in, realizing that the physical space was no longer tied to my emotional life. It had fulfilled its purpose and moved on, just as I had. Financial security allowed me to explore possibilities I had never imagined. I enrolled in courses on creative writing and financial literacy, combining passions with practical knowledge. The act of learning became a personal indulgence, no longer a means to an end. Each day was structured around intention. Morning walks along the Willamette River, afternoons spent in the library or cafe, evenings attending lectures or meeting friends. Life was no longer about survival or sacrifice. It was about presence, agency, and joy. One afternoon, while visiting a local charity focused on helping single mothers, I shared my story with a group of women. They listened, some nodding, some crying softly, recognizing their own experiences in my words. I realized then that my journey, my anger, pain, and eventual empowerment could serve as a guide for others. By setting boundaries, asserting rights, and reclaiming one's life, it was possible to break cycles of ungratefulness and redefine relationships on one's own terms. The room was filled with quiet determination, a collective energy that reminded me that resilience was contagious. Months passed, and I received a formal letter from Daniel. It was apologetic in tone, expressing regret for his actions and acknowledging the strain he had caused. He asked if we could meet, suggesting a desire for reconciliation. I read the words with a calm I had never possessed before. There was no rush, no immediate response. I understood that forgiveness was a choice, not an obligation. My life no longer depended on their approval or acknowledgement. I had learned to find validation within myself. Then came a quiet afternoon when I received a call from an unexpected number. It was Daniel. His voice, soft and hesitant, spoke of mistakes, lessons, and longing. For a moment, old emotions surfaced: hurt, love, confusion. But I let them pass without clinging. I listened, truly listened, without judgment or expectation. When he finished, I spoke. Calmly, clearly, I set conditions. There would be no immediate return to old patterns. Boundaries would be respected. Relationships would be rebuilt slowly, deliberately, and only with mutual respect. Daniel agreed quietly, a subtle acknowledgement of the balance of power that had shifted. Beyond my family, life continued to expand. I traveled to the coastal cliffs of Oregon, where the wind tore through my hair and the ocean stretched endlessly before me. Standing on the edge, I felt a profound connection to the world and to myself. The sacrifices of the past were no longer burdens, but lessons etched into my character. I was no longer defined by what I had given or lost. I was defined by the choices I now made, each one a testament to self-respect, clarity, and autonomy. The months that followed were filled with a deep, steady sense of fulfillment. Work remained meaningful, social connections were nurturing, and personal growth became a daily commitment. I discovered a creative voice I had long ignored, writing essays and stories about life, boundaries, and empowerment. People responded, readers and listeners resonating with the honesty and courage in my words. I realized that my life had value not because of the sacrifices I made for others, but because of the authenticity, resilience, and wisdom I cultivated within myself. Daniel and I eventually met months later in a neutral location. It was not perfect, old wounds were present, trust had to be rebuilt, and boundaries were firm. But it was honest. We spoke as adults, acknowledging mistakes, expressing emotions without blame, and negotiating a new relationship that respected my independence and autonomy. I realized that love did not have to be unconditional in the sense of tolerating abuse or ungratefulness. It could be thoughtful, reciprocal, and healthy. Through it all, I learned a vital truth. Life is not a ledger of debts owed, sacrifices made, or gratitude expected. Phone. Life is a series of choices, a canvas for self-expression and self-respect. When I chose to stop being complicit in patterns that harmed me, I reclaimed not only my finances and property, but also my dignity, peace, and identity. I had cut toxic attachments without bitterness, and in doing so, I had opened space for authentic joy, freedom, and connection. On a quiet evening, watching the city lights flicker across the Willamette River, I smiled genuinely for the first time in years. I was free. I had weathered betrayal, ungratefulness, and manipulation, yet emerged not bitter but empowered. My son had cut me out, but I had cut him out of the power to dictate my life. And in that act, I had discovered the true meaning of strength, love, and self-respect. The story of that Seattle house, the months of heartbreak, and the struggle to assert my rights were not just chapters of a past I endured. They were the foundation for a life fully reclaimed. I had learned that freedom often required painful clarity, that love without respect is not love at all, and that true empowerment comes from making choices that honor one's own worth. As the night deepened and the city quieted, I reflected on how far I had come. From sleepless nights of worry and heartache to days filled with deliberate joy and self-determination, my journey had transformed me. I had been a mother, a provider, a caretaker, but above all, I had rediscovered the woman I had always been beneath the sacrifices. And with that realization, I closed my eyes at peace, knowing that no one, not even my son, could take from me what I had truly earned: my life, my dignity,